Have you wrestled with imposter syndrome? Excessive and unsubstantiated self-doubt coupled with an uncanny lack of confidence? I'm your host, Betty Danowitz. Listen as I interview highly successful individuals about their experience with this imposter syndrome and how it manifests itself in their lives in this If You Ask Betty podcast series dealing with imposter syndrome. Hi, Luke. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey. Oh, anytime.
So, Luke, tell us about you.
So it always feels weird when people ask me to tell y'all about myself, because I'm always just like, feels like I'm on a dating site for the most part. But no, I did that joke with a hiring crew at one point. And they were just like, huh? And I'm like, come on, it feels that way. And they're like, well, yeah. But I am an instructional designer or a learning experience developer, whichever one that you want to use. Been in the field for about 8 years now. And before this, I was actually studying to become an English teacher for middle and high school. But as soon as I got to the end of that track, I had a very interesting student teaching semester, one where I became the story that teachers use to warn other kids about how bad experiences can be, but you can still march through and get good grades and pass. My advisor came up to me and just goes, "You don't want to be a teacher, do you?" I'm like, She goes, "Okay, don't answer that. Do you want to learn about technology?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah." And she goes, "All right, cool. Go up to OU and become an instructional designer." And I'm like, "Okay." And that's literally how it went. I got on a call with somebody, I think it was 2:00 in the morning, and found out she was the head of the department up at OU. And I got in the next semester. It's just been a very interesting ride since then.
Okay. What would you say are your biggest accomplishments in life or in work or both?
Biggest accomplishments in life. There's a lot. And I know, if I say a lot, then it may not be the biggest, but it depends on how you view what big accomplishments are. Because I can say how I've been successful in life, but I was 34. Yes, I had to think about that for a second because of age. I was 34 whenever I had my first kid, and I didn't really want kids, but my wife did. And my little daughter has changed a lot of things. Definitely showed me who I am as a person, because before then I was kind of lost. So a big accomplishment was one, having a kid. Two, learning to be okay with failure. And I say that because it was downsized from my first job and then let go from the previous job that I had. And I had a lot of people tell me that I was okay, that I'd be doing okay. I know the field and blah, 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 but I was just like, yeah, but I still feel like a failure. No matter what anybody says, it still sucks. So I had to be okay with being okay with failing every now and then. And it wasn't just on a test or something, because the lowest, oh my God, I remember back in high school, I think my lowest GPA was a 1.2 because I didn't care. I still passed college, so that's a good sign. But it's just, life changed a lot, and learning to be okay with that and learning to be okay with the changes is a big thing. But truthfully, in work-wise, I want to say my biggest success would actually have to be my first job after I got downsized. So I spent 5 months unemployed after I got downsized from my first actual instructional design job. Got downsized. At first I was just I know what I'm doing. I'm good. I have a master's degree and blah, blah, blah. 5 months later of nothing but rejections, I took whatever I could at that point. But I learned the most from that job, not just from a personal standpoint, but my first actual instructional design development job was one of the biggest in the company at the time. And I didn't even know about it at first. I was in charge of one of our first microbursts. And this was back when I worked at the post office. And it was, I wasn't the only one. I was one of 6. And what I was doing was part of a new project that the post office was doing, and I had to just do some simple training over it. So I was like, okay, microburst e-learning, nothing more than 5 minutes because it's informational. I was like, okay, it'll be fine. Worked hand in hand with graphic artists and developers, cube in cube technically, because I sat right next to the developer and we were troubleshooting storyline back and forth. I know at the time it was Captivate. So yeah, we were like, you want to talk about trial and error. 4 hours after closing, we were still figuring things out, but we were learning. We weren't actually mad because we were learning about it. And I was like, oh, okay. And at the time, our audience was none because it was just they can take it if they wanted to. But the post office liked it so much that they showed it to all their VPs, and all the VPs loved it so much that it went out to 600,000 people the next week because it went from being optional to being on the onboarding track. And I was like, oh,
something to be proud of.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah, it was interesting.
So what would others say about you if I said, tell us about Luke?
It depends on where in my career who you would
Today.
talk to. Today, there's a lot of people that would say that I know my stuff, that I know andragogy, I know pedagogy, I know instructional design theories, I know all the lessons, I know what's better for learners. I know my stuff. People would say that I'm good at what I do. And they would also state that I ask questions when I don't really technically need to be, because I'm not a yes man. If somebody does something and I'm just like, I'm not going to stand by quietly. I'm going to stand up and actually say something. And people will say that I'll have the courage to actually stand up to anybody and just be like, hey, you're not right. And here's the evidence of A, B, and C. Or, hey, this is actually hurting us more than you think.
Mm-hmm.
And they would probably say that I help encourage them as well, because that's what I was doing with most of the people that I knew back in my previous job.
Yeah.
I think, and this is something interesting to note, because I only learned about this in my last job. One person would also state, and this got me thinking a lot about myself, is that I let people be themselves. I don't have an era of you have to be a specific way around me. I let people be themselves around me. And I learned that in my previous job when somebody just straight up asked me, they're just like, why do you think you find yourself in bad situations? And I'm like, and I stopped, and then she goes, well, you just let people be themselves. And I was like, holy crap. And that set off a chain reaction of other thoughts. That was actually pretty cool to go down that road.
That's a great compliment. Yeah.
It was weird at first, but yes.
Yeah. Well, all compliments feel weird at first, don't they? I mean,
all of them.
All of them. Yeah. So thank you for telling us about yourself. What has been your experience with imposter syndrome?
Oh, this is going to be a long one because there's a lot.
That's okay.
And I say a lot because it goes 7th grade geography. That's when it first started. And I didn't do work because I just wanted to play. But I was always told that I was a special kid. Or at least whenever I was in Germany, they wanted to put me in a different class. And I always thought that was positive. Nope. And then I learned it wasn't. So you want to talk about self-confidence and going yeah, I'm doing, and then going straight downhill. Plus, I am, if you've ever read or watched Ender's Game, you know what I'm going to say. I'm a third. Basically to say that I have a brother who's 10 years older than me, and I have a sister who's 4 years older than me. And I was the third child. And I was kind of the runt. Not really the runt, because we're all 6 foot and above giants. But I was the one that saw everything happen that my brother and sister did. So I would be like, why, don't you be more like your brother? Why don't you be more like your sister type scenario? And trying to get that approval from mom and dad whenever they're looking at your brother and sister who are more successful, it kind of hurts a lot. And that's where it started. Going on through life, I experienced it, like I said, in high school, I only got like a 1.2 or 1.6 GPA, but it's just because I didn't care. Whenever I was talking to my advisor at the time, she had warned me. She goes, "You're failing this one class." I'm like, "I know." She goes, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" And I'm like, "But how many credits do I actually need to graduate?" And at the time, she goes, "Well, it's 26." And I'm like, "Okay, cool. How am I right now if I fail this class?" She goes, "Well, you're going to have," it was 27 and a half. And I was like, "So I'm going to be over." And she goes, "Don't cause trouble." And I'm like, "Okay, no." So I was smart, but I just didn't care because at the time, I mean, they were just like, "You have to be like your sister," because I went to my sister's schools, and I just didn't want to care about it. So it was just a social thing for me. And it never really clicked until after high school, because I spent some time not doing anything, just working. And then I had a friend drag me to, I say drag me, he just picked me up one day and brought me to a vocational school and goes, "Apply." And I'm like, "Okay." So I started going to a vocational school and then went to college. And college was fine. Everything was fine until I failed one of my classes. Because the imposter syndrome kind of hit. Like, I was an English major and I was failing an English class. Go figure. But I kind of had to readjust my life a little bit. I just retook the classes and passed. I had too much going on at once, so it was kind of rough. It was also the reason why the college at the time stated that you shouldn't have a like either a double major or like a side one, because if you're in English education, you're going to be going through a lot, and that's true. I did a lot.
Yeah.
So like it was okay, but whenever I started to do student teaching, the culture was so different from what I was thinking it would be or what I was used to the point where I didn't feel like I fit in. And I was like, this is just isn't really okay with me. And then I had a student teaching semester. Every other person loved me. All the other teachers loved me except for one. At the end of my student teaching semester, she had said, if you needed the degree without an actual subject field, that would have been better for you. And I looked at her and I was just like, okay. And I left. And after writing a full report about what had happened at the school, my college never placed another student with her for like 5-10 years. That's because I never got any help from her. So I always felt like I wasn't doing much, which means if I wanted to try and do something else along the lines, I'd feel like a failure. And it really struck hard after I moved and went to do my master's up here at OU. I had a job. Yes, it was working retail at GameStop. Yes, you can take those leadership skills and transfer them to anything because you're learning things. In fact, I'm learning that with Torrance Learning right now. Some of the modules that I'm going through, I was like, I learned all of this from working retail. And I was just like, huh, okay. And that's the big thing with an education, or not education, educator, or like learning instructional, whichever term you want to call it. It's the transfer of knowledge. And that's what I learned. And, but since I was working at GameStop and I wasn't working in like a school system or doing something in a related field whenever I was doing my master's, they just looked at me and they were like, you don't have a real job then. And I'm like, these are supposed to be my peers. These are supposed to be people like me. But instead they saw people like me as dropouts. And the guy, I had a classmate. He helped me get my first job, and that was the job that ended up downsizing and letting me go. And so I was just like, well, I'm not good enough. And that was mostly like the education side of things. So there's some imposter syndrome points and stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the home stuff. This is where it gets a little rough, because this is also where I don't think there's a little bit of imposter syndrome that's always going to stick with me. And that's what happens to some people. It's something that I am never going to get past or get through. It's always going to be with me. And that's one reason why I never thought I could be good enough to some people was, I mean, yeah, I was started in 7th grade, but it also started whenever my mom's mental health started going downhill. And your parents, people you look up to, when they don't want to acknowledge your successes, what can you do?
Right.
And the one person that I wanted acknowledgement from, I'm never going to get. So there are a lot of stories behind that. I'll skip most of the details, but even to this day, I could be the most successful person and nothing.
No. So when you're having this, like an episode of imposter syndrome, how does it manifest itself? And what I mean by that is, for some people, it's, perfectionism, it's overachieving, they self-sabotage. Some people like suddenly become, incredibly detailed. What do you experience? What happens? What has happened before?
So self-sabotage is a huge thing. I can tell you that. Whenever I was applying for jobs, the first time I was unemployed, I first started off tailoring my resume to everything. And I was like, okay, because I mean, that's what you're supposed to do. But after, I think, the 3rd month, I started to self-sabotage and not care. I was like, I'm just going to shotgun all these out and I don't really care. I was like, I'm not good enough. Nobody picked me up at this point. So I should have been getting interviews right off the bat. I was very inexperienced and didn't know better and didn't know how the world worked at the time. But I turned to self-sabotage, and it manifested in me thinking what other people thought of me. Like creating stories, creating like scenarios in my head where people would like talk down upon me. Is that true? Usually no. There's one instance where it actually was, and that was a very interesting instance of somebody doing something they weren't supposed to. But all the other times, it's not true. But I would always think negatively. I wouldn't think of the positive. I would always stay in the negative. And that stems from a life of, well, being surrounded by that kind of negativity. Having a mother that doesn't really respond too much to you type scenario. So it's just something that I grew up with, something that I got used to. So it was kind of defaults. And so whenever imposter syndrome hits, it would always be self-sabotage, depression, people like me thinking that people are going to view me a certain way, creating these stories and stuff like that.
Like catastrophizing?
Sure, that's a word. We'll use it today.
I mean, it's a word. I just don't know that I said it right.
I don't know, but it's a word to me, so I got it.
Yeah.
To respond, yes. It's worst case scenario. Prepare for the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
But it's supposed to be prepare for the worst case, hope for the best. I got the first half down. I didn't get the second half down.
Yeah. And you're not alone. I'll tell you that, Luke. You're not alone in self-sabotage and the catastrophizing. I think I said it right. Anyways, you're not alone in that. When you think about the way that it manifests, the way that imposter syndrome manifests itself in your life, so the self-sabotage, catastrophizing, I'm getting better at it. Are there other contributing factors? You've mentioned a few, but I'm just wondering, because we've talked in previous episodes about things that trigger us, right? So common triggers. But what I want to know is there something else specific about you that you feel like makes this imposter syndrome phenomenon happen, or maybe intensifies it or enhances it when it does?
There are a couple of different factors. One, of course, depression and anxiety. I have some anxiety issues. In fact, I'm taking sertraline to help with some anti-anxiety / anti-OCD stuff. So that doesn't help. I mean, it wouldn't help anybody, but that's kind of like sticks it. But also,
what do you mean it doesn't help? Let's unpack that.
Once the anxiety hits, I focus on something. And I don't do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method where, you know, touch 5 things, or was it see 5 things, touch 4 things? It's the senses type one.
Yeah.
And I do the breathing techniques and stuff like that. But I've been told that I also kind of fixate on something. And that's when the anxiety, like when that kicks in. And it's slowly getting better. Like it's happening less and less. It's the reason why I'm going to therapy like every week or every Friday to like help with that, to figure out things from my past. And it's helping, and certain things are diminishing, but it's once the anxiety kicks, I can feel it in my heart. I can feel like everything going up, and usually that sets my mind in something is wrong. Believe what you're thinking and react. And earlier, it was not in healthy ways, not like self-destructive or like binge drinking, drugs, or anything like that. It was just, I would always think negatively. So, yeah, it's getting better.
Okay.
To say the least. But another thing that kind of sets off my imposter syndrome is other people's success. Sometimes seeing other people that have praised me for my knowledge being successful kind of sets it off just a little bit. A certain close, like more recent example was when a friend of mine got hired at my previous job. I was his reference. I worked with him at the post office, and I taught him things at the post office. He ended up getting paid more than me. And a part of me was a little bit jealous, thinking that I'm not as good as him. But I was like, you know what? No, I need to not think that. He's a good friend. He deserves it. And I told him that. And I was like, dude, you're good. You deserve this. It's fine. And we talked about it for a second. He goes, no, you know what you're doing too. We work together hand in hand to do like mobile stuff, to do accessibility stuff. And thankfully that headed off the imposter syndrome and stopped it completely. But I could feel it like creeping up. I was like, nope. But I had that talk with him, and that was the good thing. But the job that I was downsized from where one of my classmates worked at, he was doing a whole bunch of other things. And I was like, well, now my imposter syndrome's hitting me like big time at that point, because that's when I was unemployed. Somebody at the same level of education that I had was doing a lot better than me for some reason. It's like, what am I doing wrong?
Yeah.
And I would just focus on what I was not doing correctly instead of how can I be better? It wasn't how can I be better? It was why am I wrong? And
it's,
that's a mindset.
I want to point out that you didn't say, what did I do wrong? You said, why am I wrong? So it would it's not a matter of your performance. It's a matter of who you are. Like you turned it sort of inward. And so what I'm hearing is comparison to others. And sometimes that turns into envy, right? It's not jealousy, because just a little word lesson for the folks that are listening. Jealousy is when you feel like someone's going to take something that you have away. Envy is when you want what someone else has. They're actually two different things. And so there's there's comparison that happens, and that turns into envy because you want it, or you're feeling like, why can't I have that? What's wrong with me? When the truth is, like, you're not even a part of that. None of those things matter in the long run.
Yep.
And I said it funny like that because I'm not trying to diminish your feelings, because your feelings are real. But if we were to
be able to come out of the feelings and look at it like Spock, very logically. Spock would be like, I don't know what your problem is. His life has nothing to do with yours. And so
Exactly.
I've heard this from others. So thank you for being willing to be honest and share that. Anything else that you feel like really, triggers you, or something about you that makes things worse?
One thing, I'm trying to think of like other things that trigger it, because there's probably multiple other things that trigger it. There'll be a death in the family triggered it at one point, and because we like look back at their life, and I was like, well, I never did any of that. And I'm like, well, my life's different. Of course, I'm not going to do anything like that. Like, why would I? Of course, that was, I think, my grandpa, and I did nothing that he did. So I was like, we lived like very different generational lives. I remember my brother talking about retirement, and I was like, am I even going to get there at one point? And that like was another trigger that kind of like set me off a little bit. And then I have, and this is the most recent thing. And it's not even the fact that this person has done anything. The person has not done anything to me at all. But I encountered a friend that I hadn't seen in years. And I just didn't have the same kind of, I can't say success, because he was self-taught. He didn't graduate high school because he got his GED before he even needed to. He skipped out because he goes, public education is not for me. And he's brilliant. Like, I can praise the guy, but I always felt a little envious of him, to say the least. I didn't want what he had, but I just felt bad because I was like, well, why can't I do that same thing? So like certain people will be triggers as well. And I feel bad too, because he's a friend, and I saw him like last month, him and his wife and his kids, and like we hugged, we talked for a while. We're supposed to go out or frisbee golfing at one point if my hip heals and I'm not hobbling like an old man. That's what happens when you stretch too much for 1 second in the morning, and all of a sudden something just pops. But yeah, certain people will just set it off, and they did nothing at all. Do we have things in common? Yeah, we play games. He likes different games than I do, but we can still talk. It's still awkward, and I can't explain why. Like, I even talked to my wife about it, and I was just like, I just don't feel good enough to be like a friend to him. And this is actually a good thing to bring up something inside me. So back when I worked at one of my first jobs, worked at a movie theater. And this was until I was like 18, 19, I think. I can't remember. Mall rat, had fun, worked at a movie theater because they were hiring. Why not? And one of my friends that I picked up from there, he was just like, one of the reason why we don't like invite you, or we seem a little standoffish about you, is because it feels like you're looking down on us. And I stopped him, and I was like, I don't think I'm good enough to be anybody's friend here. And he goes, do you want to be best friends? And I haven't talked to him in years, but it was a weird conversation because I didn't know that's what he thought, but I've always felt like I was never good enough to be anybody's friend. And
so that came across to them as you thought you were too good. When like you were like being dismissive because you were being dismissive because you felt like you were not enough, and they thought you were being dismissive because you thought they were not enough.
Yep. So it's my misconceptions. That's a part of me that will always, sorry, my cat stretched out and wanted to say hi.
That's all right.
It's my misconceptions will always hurt me. I can't say be the downfall of me because I always learn from them, but they hurt. And it's the jumping to conclusions a little bit too much, which I'm doing a lot better of. I don't do that nearly as much. But yeah, that started me thinking that I'm not correct with how, or like what I exude.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds weird. If you understand it, it's my presence. What I think I exude is not actually what I am doing. So I'm trying to fix that. And I've heard down the years that whenever people talk to me at first, I always seem like a little bit harder to talk to. But once the conversation gets started, everything is like golden, no problems whatsoever type scenario.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have one more question for you. Why did you want to be part of this Imposter Syndrome project?
A couple of different reasons. One, I was unemployed and I wanted to do something.
Okay.
This is a little out of my comfort zone. Thank you. This is a little bit out of my comfort zone. So I wanted to get out and do something different. I kind of wanted to talk to people, share my experiences. And one of my philosophies that I've gained throughout the years is that yes, TMI exists. Sometimes a little bit too much information can be shared, but if you don't share your experiences, how can somebody down the line who's experienced the same thing get help?
Mm-hmm.
And it can be with anything, literally anything. I'm up and open to talk about anything. I don't really care. If people just want to DM me on the side and talk about things, that's fine. I'm up for talking about anything. Because if people don't share their stories about who they actually are and what they actually go through, how can anybody figure anything out? So that's why I wanted to share my story, because I know my story could be similar to other people, but it's just that my experiences getting to that point are going to be different. Like nobody shares the same life. You can't actually walk a mile in somebody's shoes. Like my experiences stem from poor mental health, mother who has mental issues, and people who I thought were friends telling me that I don't have a real job when I do type scenario. It's all of my experiences have shaped where I've gotten so far. And I want to share as much as I can, just in case if somebody can pick up one small thread from that. This is a good opportunity to do that.
And we're so glad that you did. Thank you so much for Luke-Henry for sharing your experience with us. And thanks to the listeners. I hope you will continue with this series to hear more stories about dealing with imposter syndrome. So many amazing people deal with this every day, and sharing their story helps them and you feel less alone. So be sure to follow If You Ask Betty on LinkedIn and YouTube for more episodes and resources about imposter syndrome. Oh, and tell your friends about it. Hit the share button so that they also know that they're not alone. Peace out.